What does China want? How does China see itself in the world order? What role does China have in the future? These are pretty important questions, not just for China, but for all of us around the world, to understand what the aspirations might be of China's leadership, of the Chinese people, of Chinese culture. I am a student of history. That's where I began. And I always think it's important to look back and understand where a country comes from, to understand its past in order to understand its present and its future. And so we could say the same about China. Of course, we need to understand the historical experience that the Chinese people have been through in the last couple of hundred years, in particular in the previous decades, to understand how Chinese people, and probably to try and get inside the heads of Chinese leaders, probably where Chinese elites would want to take their country in the future. And so it seems common sense to me that we would try and understand China's past to understand its future. And so in a snapshot, before I start reading from my book, A New Era of Risk, let's just reflect on the past, a very simplistic 2-minute snapshot. China in the 19th century was humiliated. That's the way the Chinese people see their history of the 19th century. After being a great power for centuries, after being a great civilization for thousands of years, China was humiliated by the European powers who carved up China and of course treated Chinese people like second-class citizens, as European empires did around the world. This is just a statement of fact. It's not controversial. It's just a statement of how the Chinese people see the 19th century. They remember it as a period of humiliation of what they considered to be their nation, their civilization. And then, of course, you had the Japanese invasion of China, in particular through the 1930s, the horrors of the Second World War, and about 14 million Chinese losing their lives. So it's not surprising, for example, that this week, as we record this episode, China has just had its commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And that's a major event for China, to remember the victory of the Allies. And China, the United States and others were allies against the Japanese Empire. And so the commemoration of that in 2025, the 80-year commemoration of the end of the Second World War, is a big deal for China. So that's important for us to understand, I think, the way China feels about itself today. Because while there was a resolution of their civil war in 1949 with the foundation of the People's Republic of China, China continued to suffer in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s from famine, from mismanagement, from cultural revolution, etc. It wasn't until the late 1970s that China embarked on the path that it's on still today, and that it's a path of modernisation, of economic opening and reform, and that, of course, has created the great Chinese economy of today, and therefore some probably justified nationalistic pride that the Chinese feel about all that they've achieved and the position that they now have in the world. Now, this may not be popular with everyone. If you're from another rival country of China, it may appear that this is a threat and this is a concern. But I think for any of us to understand how China may act in future, we need to look back to its past. We need to understand the past. We also need to drill down a bit into Chinese ways of thinking, to understand, how do Chinese think? Are Chinese really thinking the same way today as their power becomes greater in the world, as, for example, the Europeans were thinking in the 19th century when they were colonising the rest of the world, imposing at the point of a gun their rule upon other countries? Is that how China's thinking today? It's very easy for us to project our Western thinking onto a rising China and to think, oh yes, they will act just as we did in the past. But will they? They might. They might not. I don't know the answer to that. I simply know that we need to think a little bit more carefully. We need to study a little bit more carefully the way the Chinese themselves conceive of world order, of utilising their power in the world. How do they see things? Now, that doesn't mean that we can necessarily believe everything we read or that we hear, but actually if we study carefully and with an open mind the way that China today is looking at the world, that will help us to understand it much better than simply to project our ideas and to think that they will act just like us. Because I would have thought, given our experience of recent decades, that that is pretty clear that that won't be the case, that China is unlikely to westernise as it modernises, just as the last few decades of globalisation have indicated. China will borrow and will take ideas from elsewhere in the world, but it will adapt to its own view, its own culture, its own conception of itself. So, having made those introductory comments, I'm going to read today from a section of my book, A New Era of Risk, that attempts, as an outsider, I'm only an outsider, but someone who's attempting to understand how do the Chinese see things. And this is not an endorsement of anyone's views, this is simply an honest attempt to understand. So China's vision of the future world order is what I'm going to read from. So while the books that are written, the articles that are written, that are based on the experience of an American-led world, or before that, a European-led world, exhibit expectations of how China will act, there is no guarantee that our established theories will accurately diagnose the opportunities, risks, or threats of either the transition period that we're in today or the new world order in which China may well play a major power role. In fact, it looks very likely that China will be a major world power in the decades ahead. China's leadership decision-making remains opaque to outside observers as a confusing fusion of authoritarianism with meritocratic and technocratic risk management. China has its own discourse, constructing an exceptional role for itself in the New World Order, deeply rooted in the tendencies of Chinese elites to think in long-term horizons, including a visceral memory of more than a century of humiliation, a new optimistic narrative of national rejuvenation and confidence in China's potential to be a stabilising force to support global development, which borrows heavily from interdependence theory that we've talked about in previous episodes, as well as traditional Chinese culture and philosophy. Now, China is not just another Westphalian state. It's not just another nation state like the other nation states of the world. It's a civilization state that imagines itself as having a continuous history of thousands of years as the natural centre of the world. While China's leaders plead acceptance of multipolarity in the contemporary world, some observers believe that a resurgent China will naturally seek a return to Tianxia, or a dynastic rule of all under heaven, reminiscent of how the Chinese Empire in some historical periods required tribute from other entities and acknowledgement of Chinese centrality in return for respecting tributary states' sovereignty and providing economic and other benefits. In this reading of Chinese intentions, stated commitment to interdependence may be perceived as a cloak for Chinese hegemony, but structural factors in China's highly contested region constrain it from achieving any new Tianxia-style hegemony, even if it desired such. China is understood by some observers from within the Asian region as Prometheus-bound, a giant that is surrounded by rivals, dependent on the import of resources, racked by internal instability on its borders, and therefore focused on both internal stability, a bounded order in its neighbourhood, and external economic connectivity. Indeed, China appears to be more likely to seek geo-economic power through complex interdependence than geopolitical power through conquest, therefore possibly acting quite differently from previous rising powers. This suggests a rethink is required in understanding the next phase of world order. China itself faces a set of contradictions that may yet constrain its ability to become the global strategic rival that the US fears, and that drive it towards a combination of interdependence and self-reliance. Economic development has been a higher priority than defence expenditure for sound reasons, chief amongst which is regime survival. Indeed, China's party state's internal legitimacy is widely considered to rest on its ability to deliver continued economic, not geographic, growth. Until recently, it has certainly delivered on that promise, growing strongly for decades, expanding its middle class by hundreds of millions of people, and firmly implanting in the contemporary culture a Chinese dream of prosperity and restored national prestige, to be, as the party leaders talk, a great modern socialist country in every dimension by 2049. That's the goal of the party in China, and that's the Chinese dream, to become more prosperous. And in my experience, that is firmly planted in the middle class. Most of the new middle class of hundreds of millions of people have a strong stake in continued stability and growth, including integration with the world economy. In the last 2 decades, influential Chinese scholars have developed a discourse of China's peaceful rise, and indeed the success of its model of state-driven development, which has at the same time become firmly lodged in international narratives. So in the developing world, there's an admiration for this Chinese model. In the Western advanced economies, of course, not so much, for other political reasons. China has yet to prove, though, that it can break through the so-called middle income trap and build advanced financial, education and innovation systems. In its slowing economy since COVID-19 has planted widespread doubts, actually, that China will overtake the US in economic might anytime soon. Now, of course, for decades, we have been forecasting that China, if it continued to grow at the rapid rate that it was growing in the 1990s and early 21st century, that it would pass the size of the US economy. And this is not just about economics, but this becomes a question of a country's imagination about how it sits in the world. Now, of course, the slowing of the Chinese economy, this new phase of slower growth, means that China is not overtaking the United States in overall economic size anytime soon, but still, nevertheless, I think most economists agree that it is likely at some point in the medium term. And so it's a trajectory, it's the direction that China is heading, that it's all about economics, but also it tells us something about the new Chinese confidence, and that's why we need to investigate these questions. So a little bit about economics before we continue. China remains a developing country, although is perhaps better described as an emerging economy. China's per capita gross domestic product, GDP, was $12,600 in US dollars in 2023. Actually, now in 2025, it is forecast that China will pass 14,000 US dollars per capita by the end of this year, by the end of 2025. So if it does, then it will be passing what's commonly considered to be a pretty important inflection point. When a country passes 14,000 US dollars per capita, it is said to be graduating out of the developing nation status and to be moving towards a developed economy. This places China, therefore, at the upper end of the so-called developing nations. The term developing nation is generally recognized to be self-defined, and China continues to describe itself as such. Despite China's slower rate of growth since COVID-19, it is reasonable for it to still be described as developing, it could be argued. There is, for example, still a high level of inequality in income dispersal that's been generated by its rapid growth in recent decades. So that means that for many sections of Chinese society, it does indeed remain a developing nation, even while in some of its industries, in some of its major cities, and in its financial power, China is considered to be in the process of graduating to the ranks of the developed nations. So China's self-description as a developing nation is controversial, but it will be used here in my comments as I continue through reading from my book, not as an endorsement of the term, but in recognition of its relevance to China's championing of the developed nations in its normative challenges to the international system. China talks about its role as a leader in the developing world and talks about the values of the developing world, and so we'll come back to that. China faces numerous challenges in bridging this middle income gap, not least the rapid ageing of its population and the propensity of its people to save rather than spend, to prepare for difficult times, which has held back the development of a more efficient, demand-driven economy. And we know that the Chinese government is rolling out all kinds of initiatives to try and stimulate a demand-driven economy. This in the period of slow growth and a period of property market problems is proving quite difficult, quite challenging. But let's go beyond economics. Beyond China's economic achievements and challenges, its role in the world remains ambiguous. Despite its grand narratives, and perhaps partly because of its more assertive wolf warrior diplomacy in recent years and some more aggressive military positioning in its region, it has built little soft power, at least in its relationships with the West in particular, where distrust is growing into structural competition, even if many developing countries welcome the public goods offered by China through its initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. The steady rise of Xi Jinping has manifested as the party state's conviction to double down on its hybrid Leninist, Confucianist governance model, maintaining order and stability above all else in pursuit of the national rejuvenation narrative and its parallel international agenda, which includes the Belt and Road and other connectivity platforms, forging a greater role for China in global governance. In 2021, the Communist Party of China commemorated its centenary amidst increasing authoritarianism. More centralization was going on, with scholars noting China's leadership appeared convinced of the superiority of its governance model. It remains uncertain whether its latest phase of centralizing power indicates some fragility or whether it indicates strength in the face of the challenges that China faces in this new international transition. The Chinese leadership, for sure, is determined not to repeat the mistakes of Gorbachev's Soviet Union or China's century of humiliation at the hands of Western powers and Japan, as we discussed earlier. This is evident in an unrelenting alertness to any hint of Western intervention in what China considers to be matters within its national sovereignty. And so that's important to understand, I think. In China, this is irrefutably the era of Xi Jinping. And if historical global shifts are popularly understood quite often as identified with leaders, then his period of leadership is becoming symbolic in China of its growing strength in the international system, just as the disruptive and chaotic leadership of Donald Trump is popularly perceived as marking American decline. If the rise of China is likely to continue, it will be important to understand the world order envisaged and expounded by Xi and the elite that he represents, or at least to the extent that such understanding is possible, given the opaque nature of the Chinese political system. So Xi Jinping's narratives and initiatives for a future world order are characteristically broadly conceptual and long-term in nature, while still appearing to some observers to be vague and ill-defined in the short term. Nevertheless, as narratives that are issuing from the all-encompassing party state, they are particularly useful to understand as providing the parameters for foreign policy development and actions. They represent important attempts by a more confident China to shape new norms and new narratives on the international stage, coupled with practical initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese leaders commonly outline a broad vision, and the details are commonly filled in later. This is a common practice in Chinese culture. As practical initiatives are developed, often there's a grand vision first, and then the initiative is rolled out as reactions and risks are assessed over time. While China's international initiatives are frequently represented in the Western discussions as illegitimate because they're based on Chinese rather than liberal norms, the Chinese narrative envisions them as a contribution to a new world order built on mutually beneficial deeper interdependence. As such, they are represented in Chinese narratives as a coherent contribution to what Xi Jinping calls a community with a shared future, which envisages a new model for great power competition, a shift away from the traditional binary collective security thinking towards common security with win-win outcomes, international equality for different civilizational philosophies, and a new commitment to ecological balance. So that's all the rhetoric. I'm not necessarily saying that all the rhetoric will be lived up to, but you could say that about any civilization or about any culture or about any great power. But understanding the rhetoric, understanding the thinking behind it, and the kinds of policies that will flow from that rhetoric, I think will be important for us in the years ahead. Central to the Chinese narrative of new thinking in international relations is the common assertion that China has never been and never will be an aggressor or seek hegemony. Regardless of the dubious historical accuracy of this narrative, it is often repeated and sets the broad parameters of China's international initiatives and concept of Chinese exceptionalism, just as the US narrative of its own exceptionalism sets the broad parameters for its liberal international order. The Chinese concept of world order is further based upon traditional developing nation principles embraced as early as the 1955 Bandung Conference in Indonesia: peaceful coexistence, independence, and non-interference. So this question of national sovereignty being so important to the newly emerging post-colonial world, so important to the non-aligned movement, these are still the key principles that China espouses and claims to believe in. In its claims to greater consistency in application of non-interference, the Chinese shared future could be understood as a further development of the Westphalian model, taking a concept that previously privileged European nations and their new world creations and extending it to the whole international system. This is an important question. Is what China doing? Is China taking the concept of the nation state, of national sovereignty that was expounded in the liberal international order under US leadership, is China taking that to its next conclusion, that actually there should be equality of all nations? That's the rhetoric, and it's why it's so attractive to the developing world. While this was the promise, national sovereignty and equality was the promise of the US concept of world order developed in the post-war period, Chinese and many in the developing world perceive the US-led liberal international order as rather inconsistently imposing Western values, including regular foreign intervention, while the Chinese version of world order claims not to impose values or infringe in any way on national sovereignty. China has for some decades positioned itself as a champion of national sovereignty, with this featured as a central principle of its foreign policy. The Chinese global vision, therefore, while not liberal, claims to propose a more democratic international order. It claims to build on, rather than to replace, the Western-led world order, while determined to no longer be a rule taker in the international system, perhaps to become a rule maker. What this really means in practice, as China gathers more power in the international system, remains a work in progress, but it is being interpreted in the West and in some quarters in China as a looming clash of values. In seeking a stabilising role for resurgent China, leading scholars such as Wang Jise urge a discourse of common interests rather than a focus on conflicting values, noting the risks in the current geopolitical climate and that it is difficult to manage risks by reaching compromise solutions if a dispute is framed in terms of values. This is an important point, I think. If we imagine in the West that we must always judge other countries on the basis of values, how do we build trust? How do we develop interdependence? This was a question in interdependence theory, that maybe we are only able to develop interdependence with like-minded people. Or is China right in saying that actually we don't need to judge each other by our values? This is a fundamental question, I think, in the international relations of the future, as China continues to expound of quite a different concept than the West. This confidence that interdependence can be achieved through focusing on mutual interests is based on the widespread assumption of elite opinion in China, including realist scholars. And most scholars in China are realist in the international relations sense, that China poses no security threat to the US or other countries. This is widely believed in Chinese society as well, that Chinese people that I've talked to, many Chinese people across different levels of society, don't comprehend why the West feels threatened by China. They don't believe that they are a threat to the outside world. So again, trying to get inside someone else's head. How do other people think? This is important to understand. Nevertheless, a common belief appears to be emerging within China that the US is locking itself into a new strategy to contain and constrain China, seeking to not only attack its geoeconomic and strategic vulnerabilities, but to undermine its stability and system of government. In the Chinese narrative, the recent US shift in strategy constitutes a threat to economic interdependence, with widespread fears that the US may in future blockade trade, for example, in the South China Sea, and further pose the greater threat to global peace with its military adventurism, while the academic discourse mirrors the claims of political leaders that the Chinese civilization state has no desire for hegemony and indeed has fought no war since 1979. And of course there are arguments as well that China has fought no war of conquest actually for hundreds of years. This is a widely believed view in China. So China has a different conception of its place in the world than its rival, the United States, which of course has played quite a different role in recent times. Events such as the Russian war against Ukraine and the Western response, which commonly conflates China with Russia as a threat, particularly in Europe, appear to have further reinforced fears in China that it must prepare for the worst and expect possible conflict with the US, according to newspaper reports and talking to people in China. So this is a view that's developing, and perhaps this could be a real risk, actually, that even though Chinese people and even though Chinese elites and Chinese scholars believe that China is a country of peace, if China feels that it is threatened, if China feels that actually the US is a threat to its stability and to its future interests, does that lead to a change in thinking about conflict? So all of these are significant risks, and we really need to understand not only how does the US see China, which I think we can talk more about, but how does China see the risks ahead? So it might appear to observers of the contemporary decline into geopolitical confrontation that the structural competition embedded in the US worldview, regardless of China's stated commitment to interdependence, may generate in China the more aggressive rising power that the West fears. If both the US and China are steeling themselves for structural competition, they may become trapped in the prisoner's dilemma, that we talked about earlier, and they may produce suboptimal outcomes for all parties. The Chinese narratives are certainly deeply distrusted in the traditional powers. Chinese observers commonly interpret Western cognition to be impaired from comprehending China's commitment to long-term interdependence, noting that Western reactions appear affected by not only normative frameworks, so Westerners thinking in Western norms, but also manifest in emotional rather than scientific responses to crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic, domestic political dysfunction, spring from media and social media discourse that has become disconnected from concepts of truth, and further reflexively grasp for certainty in theory rather than pragmatically dealing with empirics. So all of that is complicated, but it's a view in China that I've heard and that I've read as well, a view in China that the West is simply not comprehending because the West is reacting ideologically, with emotion, with fear, and social media and media narratives are totally disconnected from facts or from reality. This is a Chinese view of the West, and it aligns with quite a dangerous, I think, and probably ill-conceived view that America is declining. I don't subscribe to that view. I think America will continue to be a very significant power in the world, but it does align. If there's a view that America is declining, that its media and social media, its political elite are disconnected from reality, this is a very interesting view that China has of the West. A realist scholar called Jiang represents a common view that US-China structural competition is inevitable, that the US has moved to take advantage of a short-term opportunity to contain China, and that China must therefore steel itself with political cohesion and cultural self-confidence to forge a new great power relationship in time. Another internal critic within China named Deng, not Deng Xiaoping, argues that Xi's hardening statism is partly a response to US attempts at containment of China's rise, mobilising the population to bandwagon with a Communist Party that will in turn need to evolve to maintain its legitimacy. Now, one of the critical problems in assessing motives and predicting future scenarios is that Chinese decision-making, of course, remains opaque and unfamiliar to external observers. The Chinese government's response to COVID-19, both in its characteristically authoritarian initial response, which included some mistakes, we might say, in Western terms, but of course, within China, you can't say things like that. But later, its great success in containing the outbreak within China, followed in turn by further, perhaps excessive control measures later in the pandemic, demonstrated to the outside world the two sides of the same coin, actually, alerting many people who are not so familiar with China, but perhaps alerting them for the first time to both China's domestic authoritarianism and its massive capability to mobilise. So perhaps the whole COVID-19 experience introduced people who didn't know China so well to some things that frightened the West about China. I think this is worth exploring, actually. I think it is relevant. So neither of these points about China's domestic authoritarianism, its belief in stability, or its massive capability to mobilise, neither of these provided reassurance in the face of a pandemic, as the virus, of course, spread around the world. And similar fearful responses might be expected in future crises. Further, China's clumsy international public relations campaigns, including these more aggressive wolf warrior diplomats, which seems to have calmed down in recent times, but some of that, which of course was responding to equally aggressive American-style diplomacy in the first Trump administration and now in the second Trump administration. So none of this is pointing the finger only at China, but China started to mimic the aggressive language that the Trump White House was using, with some quite aggressive language coming out of Beijing as well. And that backfired in the West. It really did, just as the Trump rhetoric has backfired in the rest of the West as well. It contributed to a growing pessimism about the prospects of international cooperation the next time the world faces a crisis, and contributes to a fear of China's role in the new world order. Now, I'll have some more to say about China in the new world order, and including some discussion about voices within China next time.